Hello and welcome to this production of The Unconscious Prisoner, Why Evolution Favoured Free Will, written by David Christopher Lane and narrated by myself, Jack Barwise. Hopefully you enjoy it. The Prisoner's Dilemma. Free will is to mind what chance is to matter. Charles Darwin. Back in 1980, when I was attending the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, my childhood friend Keith and his delightful wife Grace came to visit me. We decided to take a boat to Alcatraz Island, home of the infamous prison which housed dangerous prisoners for over 3 decades, from 1934 to 63. After shutting down formal operations, it had become a popular tourist destination for those visiting San Francisco. As we disembarked, our guide gave us a tour of the prison, which was still in relatively good shape. Even the cells were kept clean and in working order. As I looked around at the compact buildings atop the small island, I realized why it was nearly impossible to escape. The San Francisco Bay is not only extremely difficult to navigate, with ever-changing winds and currents, but the water is also quite cold even during the summer months. The highlight of the trip is when we were asked to enter one of the cell blocks, which was only 5 feet by 9 feet. It was stripped bare, except for a toilet, a small sink, and cramped sleeping cot. Right after we entered into the claustrophobic chamber, the tour guide then shut the bars and had us imagine what it would be like to be a prisoner, sentenced to 10 years, and to have endure such a life. It was, I must admit, beyond creepy. Knowing that we weren't really prisoners, but only temporary visitors, made us actually enjoy the 5 minutes in the cell, since we knew that we were always free to go. 40 years later, as I was lecturing about evolution to my honours philosophy class at Mount San Antonio College, one of my students asked me an astute question about why humans tend to believe that they have free will, especially since almost everything that happens is out of our control. Her question for some odd reason jarred my memory and made me think of my brief sojourn to Alcatraz Island. I then had one of those aha moments which helped me clarify my response to the query about free will and why evolution would have favoured such a feature, even if it was on closer inspection an illusory one. Dovetailing with Plato's instructive allegory of the cave, I made the following response to my student. What is it that the feeling of free will provides us? A sense of mobility, a sense of latitude, a sense of multiple options. In sum, a sense of freedom. But let's envision that we had no free will whatsoever, and that every action that we performed was completely out of our control. Everything is predetermined by unconscious processes, and our I-ness is merely the result of prior causes. Essentially, we have no freedom whatsoever, but are witnesses to a predetermined course of action. Our bodies and even our minds are constrained by forces beyond our control. More pointedly, we are captives bounded by a system which precedes and exceeds us in every direction. Further conceive that you realize this truth and know that there is no escape. How would you then feel? For most of us, I suspect it would be a horrific realization, as if we suddenly became aware that we were prisoners in our own body. A terrifying example that may be applicable here is locked-in syndrome. This is a condition which is also known as a pseudocoma, in which a patient is aware but cannot move or communicate verbally due to complete paralysis of nearly all voluntary muscles in the body except for vertical eye movements and blinking. Jean-Dominique Bauby is perhaps the most famous person to suffer LIS. His story is poignantly described in the French book Le Scaphandre et le Papillon, later translated into English under the title The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. As Carl Catherine explains, Bobby's narrative of locked-in syndrome as told in his memoir allows us to glimpse into the loneliness and powerlessness he experienced as he lived in his deadened body on a day-to-day basis. Such an intimate account gives us several anthropological insights into long-standing questions about the body and self, namely, how are you supposed to live when your body can perceive but can no longer respond? How would people know inside the immobile body you still alive? Indeed, his unique experience invites us to reflect on the anthropological concepts and relations of the body, self and embodiment. Being fully paralyzed after years of having bodily mobility can be overwhelmingly traumatic. The comparison between both lifestyles can be so jarring and so disruptive that it is little wonder that patients undergo severe depression and may contemplate suicide. How can one possibly survive such a tragic situation? Jean-Dominique Bauby's narrative, so painstakingly related, as it was by the blinking of his left eye, provided us with a clue. He oscillates between moments of great hope and great pain. What kept him going, besides the love and affection of his family, was his expectation that he would get better in the future. Even the slightest of improvements would make him supremely happy. As Bobby explains, "But for now, I would be the happiest man if I could just swallow the overflow of saliva endlessly flooding my mouth." In an analogous way, every human being, every animal, every insect, and every living thing is ultimately locked in to the body that defines it. But do we, like Jean-Dominique Bobby, realize our existential circumstance? Do we fully understand that our consciousness is restrained by an Alcatraz-like prison cell? Most of the time, clearly not. The question that immediately raises its head is why not? There are, of course, many possible answers to this query, but I think one tantalizing answer is that free will is an evolutionary hack to provide organisms with complex forms of awareness, an illusory feeling of flexibility, such that even if one's own navigation was premeditated by unseen powers, the operating I-ness would believe, inaccurately of course, that it was the commander and the chief architect of almost all the choices that it made. Nature, in other words, has blinded us from truly seeing how enveloped we are by providing a free will user interface, which allows us to believe that we have at our command a plethora of present and future options. We are unconscious internees oblivious to our own captivity. A Zen-like riddle reveals in a nutshell evolution's ploy. How do you keep a prisoner from escaping from the ward? Make him or her convinced that they are not in a penitentiary. This idea makes me wonder if someone like Jean-Dominique Bobby would feel different about his situation if he was born with locked-in syndrome, and he never knew otherwise. As one ancient poem articulated, free to fly are the thoughts of men, but flying itself is not free, bounded by a sky with a gravitational arc. Yes, our imagination is truly a magnificent tool, allowing our minds an extraordinary elasticity. But that is precisely the hack. The idea that we are free is not freedom itself, but sustains us all the same to live on and not self-destruct or become overcome with hopelessness. For instance, if when visiting Alcatraz Island one was free to come and go as one pleases, then that very place would not seem like a prison at all, and one would certainly not feel like a prisoner. In this context we are rather agnostic prisoners, never quite realizing our own entrapment, whether nature has jerry-rigged our imprisonment, via our neurology, in such a way that we live as if we are free within our own cages, without knowing how encircled we really are. As Lisa Zeiger for size.org clearly elucidates, consciousness has an evolutionary selective advantage. It provides us with the illusion of responsibility, which is beneficial for society, if not for individuals as well. In this sense, consciousness is our preview function that comforts us into thinking that we are in control of what we will, or at least may, do ahead of time. As Cashmore notes, the irony is that the very existence of these free will genes is predicted on their ability to con us into believing in free will and responsibility. However, in reality, all behavioral decisions are nothing more than a reflection of our genetic and environmental history. Whereas the impressions are that we are making free conscious decisions, the reality is that consciousness is simply a state of awareness that reflects the input signals, and these are unavoidable consequences of GES, genes, environment, and stochasticism, Cashmore explained. Few neurobiologists would argue with the notion that consciousness influences behavior by acting through unconscious neural activity, he said. More controversial is the notion that consciousness plays a relatively minor role in governing our behavior. The conscious mind is conceivably more a mechanism of following unconscious neural activity than is one of directing such activity. I find it interesting to compare this line of thinking with that of Freud, who created a controversy by suggesting that the unconscious mind played a role in our behavior. The way of thinking regarding these matters now has moved to the extent that some are questioning what role, if any, the conscious mind plays in directing behavior. Namely, Freud was right to an extent that was much greater than he realized. To summarize, Cashmore's argument is that free will is an illusion derived from consciousness, but consciousness has an evolutionary advantage as conferring the illusion of responsibility. So what is the point of publicizing the fact that we have no free will and letting everyone off the hook for individual responsibility? Cashmore says that as researchers deepen their understanding of the molecular basis of human behavior, it will become increasingly difficult to entertain the fallacy of free will. Free will as a trick of the brain. Adam Bear. Perhaps in the very moments that we experience a choice, our minds are rewriting history, fooling us into thinking that this choice that was actually completed after its consequences was subconsciously perceived, was a choice that we had made all along. Though the precise way in which the mind could do this is still not fully understood, similar phenomena have been documented elsewhere. For example, we see the apparent motion of a dot before seeing that dot reach its destination, and we feel phantom touches moving up our arm before feeling an actual touch moving further up our arm. Postdictive illusions of this sort are typically explained by noting that there's a delay in the time it takes information out in the world to reach conscious awareness, because it lags slightly behind reality. Consciousness can anticipate future events that haven't yet entered awareness, but have been encoded subconsciously, allowing for an illusion in which the experienced future alerts the experienced past. Because it lags slightly behind reality, consciousness can anticipate future events that haven't yet entered awareness, but have become encoded subconsciously, allowing for an illusion in which the experienced future alters the experienced past. In one of our studies, participants were repeatedly presented with 5 white circles in random locations on a computer monitor, and were asked to quickly choose one of the circles in their head before one lit up red. If a circle turned red so fast that they didn't feel like they were able to complete their choice, participants could indicate that they ran out of time. Otherwise, they indicated whether they had chosen the red circle before it turned red, or had chosen a different circle. We explored how likely people were to report a successful prediction among these instances in which they believed that they had time to make a choice. Unbeknownst to the participants, the circle that lit up red on each trial of the experiment was selected completely at random by our computer script. Hence, if participants were truly completing their choices when they claimed to be completing them, before one of the circles turned red, they should have chosen the red circle on approximately 1 in 5 trials. Yet participants' reported performance deviated unrealistically far from this 20% probability, exceeding 30% when a circle turned red especially quickly. This pattern of responding suggests that participants' minds had sometimes swapped the order of events in conscious awareness, creating an illusion that a choice had preceded the colour change, when in fact it was biased by it. Importantly, participants' reported choice of the red circle dropped down near 20% when the delay for a circle to turn red was long enough that the subconscious mind could no longer play this trick in consciousness and get wind of the colour change before a conscious choice was completed. This result ensured that participants weren't simply trying to deceive us, or themselves, about their prediction abilities, or just liked reporting that they were correct. In fact, the people who showed our time-dependent illusion were often completely unaware of their above-chance performance when asked about it in debriefing after the experiment. Moreover, in a related experiment, we found that the bias to choose correctly was not driven by confusion or uncertainty about what was chosen. Even when participants were highly confident in their choice, they showed a tendency to choose correctly at an impossibly high rate. Taken together, these findings suggest that we may be systematically misled about how we make choices, even when we have strong intuitions to the contrary. Why, though, would our minds fool us in such a seemingly silly way in the first place? Wouldn't this illusion wreak havoc on our mental lives and behaviours? Maybe not. Perhaps the illusion can simply be explained by appeal to limits in the brain's perceptual processing, which only messes up at the very short timescales measured in our or similar experiments, and which are likely to affect us in the real world. A more speculative possibility is that our minds are designed to distort our perception of choice, and that this distortion is an important feature, not simply a bug, of our cognitive machinery. For example, if the experience of choice is a kind of casual inference, as Wegner and Wheatley suggest, then swapping the order of choice and action in conscious awareness may aid in the understanding that we are physical beings who can produce effects out in the world. More broadly, this illusion may be central to developing a belief in free will, and in turn, motivating punishment. The Fable of Intelligible Freedom, Friedrich Nietzsche. The history of the sentiments by means of which we make a person responsible. Thus, in turn, man is made responsible for his operations, then for his actions, then for his motives, and finally for his nature. Eventually it is discovered that even this nature cannot be responsible, inasmuch as it is an absolutely necessary consequence, concreted out of the elements and influences of past and present things. That man, therefore, cannot be made responsible for anything, neither for his nature, nor his motives, nor his actions, nor his effects. It has therewith come to be recognized that the history of moral valuations is at the same time the history of an error, the error of responsibility, which is based upon the error of the freedom of will. Nobody is responsible for his actions, nobody for his nature. To judge is identical with being unjust. This also applies when an individual judges himself. The theory is as clear as sunlight, and yet every one prefers to go back into the shadow and the untruth for fear of the consequences. Free Will and Fatalism. Arthur Schopenhauer. No thoughtful man can have any doubt, after the conclusions reached in my prize essay on moral freedom, that such freedom is to be sought not anywhere in nature, but outside of it. The only freedom that exists is of a metaphysical character. In the physical world, freedom is an impossibility. Accordingly, while our several actions are in no wise free, every man's individual character is to be regarded as a free act. He is such and such a man, because once for all it is his will to be that man. For the will itself, and in itself, and also insofar as it is to manifest in an individual, and accordingly constitutes the original and fundamental desires of that individual, is independent of all knowledge, because it is antecedent to such knowledge. All that it receives from knowledge is the series of motives by which it successively develops its nature and makes itself cognizable or visible. But the will itself, as something that lies beyond time, and so long as it exists at all, never changes. Therefore every man, being what he is, placed in the circumstances which for the moment obtain, but which on their past also arise by strict necessity, can absolutely never do anything else than just what at that moment he does do. Accordingly, the whole course of a man's life, in all its incidences great and small, is as necessarily predetermined as the course of a clock. The main reason of this is that the kind of metaphysical free act which I have described tends to become a knowing consciousness, a perceptive intuition, which is subject to the forms of space and time. By means of those forms, the unity and the indivisibility of the act are represented as drawn, as under, into a series of states and events, which are subject to the principle of sufficient reason in its four forms. And it is this that is meant by necessity. But the result of it all assumes a moral complexion. It amounts to this, that by what we do we know what we are, and by what we suffer we know what we deserve. Further, it follows from this that a man's individuality does not rest upon the principle of individualization alone. Further, it follows from this that a man's individuality does not rest upon the principle of individuation alone, and that therefore is not altogether phenomenal in its nature. On the contrary, it has its roots in the thing in itself, in the will which is the essence of each individual. The character of this individual is itself individual, but how deep the roots of individuality extend is one of the questions which I do not undertake to answer. In this connection it deserves to be mentioned that even Plato, in his own way, represented the individuality of a man as a free act. He represented him as coming into the world with a given tendency, which was the result of the feelings and character already attaching to him in accordance with the doctrine of metempsychosis. The Brahmin philosophers also express the unalterable fixity of the innate character in a mystical fashion. They say that Brahma, when a man is produced, engraves his doings and sufferings in written characters on his skull, and that his life must take shape in accordance therewith. They point to the jagged edges and the sutures of the skull, bones as evidence of this writing, and the purport of it, they say, depends on his previous life and actions. The same view appears to imply the Christian, or rather the Pauline, dogma predestination. But this truth, which is universally confirmed by experience, is attended with another result. All genuine merit, moral as well as intellectual, is not merely physical or empirical in its origin, but metaphysical. That is to say, it is given a priori, and not a posteriori. In other words, it lies innate, and is not acquired, and therefore its source is not a mere phenomenon, but the thing in itself. Hence it is that every man achieves only that which is irrevocably established in his nature, or is born with him. Intellectual capacity needs, it is true, to be developed just as many natural products need to be cultivated in order that we may enjoy or use them. But just as in the case of a natural product, no cultivation can take the place of the original material, neither can it do so in the case of intellect. That is the reason why qualities which are merely acquired, or learned, or enforced, that is, qualities are posteriori, whether moral or intellectual, are not real or genuine, but superficial only, and possessed of no value. This is a conclusion of true metaphysics, and experience teaches the same lesson to all who can look below the surface. Nay, it is proved by the great importance which we had all attached to such innate characteristics as physiognomy and external appearance in the case of a man who is all at all distinguished, and that is why we are so curious to see him. Superficial people, to be sure, and for very good reasons, commonplace people too, will be of the opposite opinion, for if anything fails them, they will thus be enabled to console themselves by thinking that it is still to come. The world, then, is not merely a battlefield where victory and defeat receive their due recompense in a future state. No, the world is itself the last judgment on it. Every man carries with him the reward and disgrace that he deserves, and this no other than the doctrine of the Brahmins and Buddhists as it is taught in the theory of metempsychoses. The question has been raised, what two men would do who lived a solitary life in the wilds and met each other for the first time. Hobbes, Pufendorf, and Rousseau have given different answers. Pufendorf believed that they would approach each other as friends, Hobbes, on the contrary, as enemies, Rousseau that they would pass each other by in silence. All three are both right and wrong. This is just a case in which the incalculable difference that there is an innate moral disposition between one individual and another would make its appearance. The difference is so strong that the question here raised might be regarded as the standard and the measure of it. For there are men in whom the sight of another man at once rouses a feeling of enmity, since their inmost nature exclaims at once, "That is not me." There are others in whom the sight awakens immediate sympathy. Their inmost nature says, "That is me over again." Between the two there are countless degrees. That in this most important matter we are so totally different is a great problem, nay, a mystery. In regard to this priori nature of moral character, there is the matter of a varied reflection in a work by Balstrom, a Danish writer, entitled Historical Contributions to the Knowledge of Man in the Savage State. He is struck by the fact that intellectual culture and moral excellence are shown to be entirely independent of each other, inasmuch as one is often found without the other. The reason of this, as we shall find, is simply that moral excellence is in no wise springs from reflection, which is developed by intellectual culture, but from the will itself, the constitution of which is innate and not susceptible in itself of any improvement by means of education. Balstrom represents most nations as very vicious and immoral, and on the other hand he reports that excellent traits of character are found amongst some savage people, as for instance amongst the Orocheses, the inhabitants of the island of Savu, the Tunguses, and the Peleu Islanders. He thus attempts to solve the problem, how is it that some tribes are so remarkably good when their neighbours are all bad? It seems to me that the difficulty may be explained as follows. Moral qualities, as we know, are hereditable. An isolated tribe, such as is described, might take its rise in some one family, and ultimately in a single ancestor, who happened to be a good man, and then maintain its purity. Is it not the case, for instance, that on many unpleasant occasions, such as repudiation of public debts, filibustering raids, and so on, the English have often reminded the North Americans of their descent from English penal colonists? It is a reproach, however, which can apply only to a small part of the population. It is marvellous how every man's individuality, that is to say, the union of a definite character with a definite intellect, accurately determines all his actions and thoughts down to the most unimportant detail, as though it were a dye which pervaded them, and how, in consequence, one man's whole course of life, in other words, his inner and outer history, turns out so absolutely different from another's. As a botanist knows a plant in its entirety from a single leaf, as Cuvier from a single bone constructed the whole animal, so an accurate knowledge of a man's whole character may be attained from a single characteristic act. That is to say, he himself may to some extent be constructed from it, even though the act in question is of very trifling consequence. Nay, that is the most perfect test of all. For a matter of importance, people are on their guard. In trifles they follow their natural bent, without much reflection. That is why Seneca's remark that even the smallest things may be taken as evidence of character is so true. Argumenta, Morum ex minima quoque licet capere. If a man shows by his absolutely unscrupulous and selfish behaviour in small things that a sentiment of justice is foreign to his disposition, he should not be trusted with a penny unless on due security. For who will believe that the man who every day shows that he is unjust in all matters other than those which concern property, and whose boundless selfishness everywhere protrudes through the small affairs of ordinary life, which are subject to no scrutiny, like a dirty shirt through the holes of a ragged jacket, who, I ask, will believe that such a man will act honourably in matters of moem and tuum, without any other incentive but that of justice? The man who has no conscience in small things will be a scoundrel in big things. If we neglect small traits of character, we have only ourselves to blame if we afterwards learn to our disadvantage what this character is in the great affairs of life. On the same principle, we ought to break with so-called friends even in matters of trifling moment, if they show a character that is malicious or bad or vulgar, so that we may avoid the bad turn which only awaits us for an opportunity of being done to us. The same thing applies to servants. Let it always be our maxim, better alone than amongst traitors. Of a truth, the first and foremost step in all knowledge of mankind is the conviction that a man's conduct, taken as a whole, and all its essential particulars, is not governed by his reason or by any of the resolutions which he may make in virtue of it. No man becomes this or that by wishing to be it, however earnestly. His acts proceed from his innate and unalterable character, and they are more immediately and particularly determined by his motives. A man's conduct, therefore, is the necessary product of both character and motive. It may be illustrated by the course of a planet, which is the result of the combined effect of the tangential energy of which it is endowed and the centripetal energy which operates from the sun. In this simile, the former energy represents character and the latter influence of motive. It is almost more than a mere simile. The tangential energy, which properly speaking is the source of the planet's motion, whilst on the other hand the motion is kept in check by gravitation, is, from a metaphysical point of view, the will manifesting itself in that body. To grasp this fact is to see that we really never form anything more than a conjecture of what we shall do under circumstances which are still to happen, although we often take our conjecture for a resolve. When, for instance, in the pursuance of a proposal, a man with the greatest sincerity and even eagerness accepts an engagement to do this or that on the occurrence of a certain future event, it is by no means certain that he will fulfil the engagement, unless he is so constituted that the promise which he gives, in itself and as such, is always and everywhere a motive sufficient for him, by acting upon him through the considerations of honour, like some external compulsion. But above and beyond this, what he will do on the occurrence of that event may be foretold from true and accurate knowledge of his character, and the external circumstances under the influence of which he will fall, and it may with complete certainty be foretold from this alone. Nay, it is a very easy prophecy, if he has already seen a like position, for he will inevitably do the same thing a second time, provided that on the first occasion he had a true and complete knowledge of the facts of the case. For as I have often remarked, a final cause does not impel a man by being real, but by being known. Causa finalis non movent secundum suum es real, sed secundum es cognitum. Whatever he failed to recognize or understand the first time could have no influence upon his will, just as the electric current stops when some isolating body hinders the action of the conductor. This unalterable nature of character, and the consequent necessity of our actions, are made very clear to a man who has not, on any given occasion, behaved as he ought to have done, by showing a lack of resolution, or endurance, or courage, or some other quality demanded at that moment. Afterwards he recognizes what it is that he ought to have done, and sincerely repenting of his incorrect behaviour, he thinks to himself, if the opportunity were offered to me again, I should act differently. It is offered once more. The same occasion recurs, and to his great astonishment he does precisely the same thing over again. The best examples of the truth in question are in every way furnished by Shakespeare's plays. It is a truth in which he was thoroughly imbued, and his intuitive wisdom expressed in a concrete shape on every page. I shall here, however, give an instance of it in case in which he makes it remarkably clear, without exhibiting any sign of affection in the matter. for he was a real artist and never set out from general ideas. His method was obviously to work up to the psychological truth which he grasped directly and intuitively, regardless of the fact that few would notice or understand it, and without the smallest idea that some dull and shallow fellows in Germany would one day proclaim far and wide that he wrote his work to illustrate moral commonplaces. I allude to the character of the Earl of Northumberland, whom we find in 3 plays in succession, although he does not take a leading part in any one of them. Nay, he appears only in a few scenes, distributed over 15 acts. Consequently, if the reader is not very attentive, a character exhibited at such great intervals and its moral identity may easily escape his notice, even though it has by no means escaped the poets. He makes the Earl appear everywhere with a noble and knightly grace, and talk in a language suitable to it. Nay, he sometimes puts very beautiful and even elevated passages into his mouth. At the same time, he is very far from writing after the manner of Schiller, who was fond of painting the devil black, and whose moral approval or disapproval of these characters which he presented could be heard in their own words. With Shakespeare, and also with Goethe, every character, as long as he is on the stage and speaking, seems to be absolutely in the right, even though it were the devil himself. In this respect, let the reader compare Duke Alba, as he appears in Goethe, with the same character in Schiller. We make the acquaintance of the Earl of Northumberland in the play Richard II, where he is the first to hatch a plot against the king in favour of Bolingbroke. Afterwards Henry IV, to whom he even offers some personal flattery. Act 2, Scene 3. In the following act he suffers a reprimand because in speaking of the king he talks of him as Richard, without more ado, but protests that he did it only for brevity's sake. A little later his insidious words induce the king to surrender. In the following act, when the king renounces the crown, Northumberland treats him with such harshness and contempt that the unlucky monarch is quite broken, and losing all patience once more exclaims to him, "Fiend, thou torment'st me ere I come to hell." At the close Northumberland announces to the new king that he has sent the heads of the former king's adherents to London. In the following tragedy, Henry IV, he hatches a plot against the new king in just the same way. In the 4th act we see the rebels united, making preparations for the decisive battle on the morrow, and only waiting impatiently for Northumberland and his division. At last there arrives a letter from him, saying that he is ill, and that he cannot entrust his force to anyone else, but that nevertheless the others should go forward with courage and make a brave fight. They do so, but greatly weakened by his absence, they are completely defeated. Most of their leaders are captured, and his own son, the valorous Hotspur, falls by the hand of the Prince of Wales. Again, in the following play, the 2nd part of Henry IV, we see him reduced to a state of the fiercest wrath by the death of his son, and maddened by the thirst for revenge. Accordingly he kindles another rebellion, and the heads of it assemble once more. In the 4th act, just as they are about to give battle, and are only waiting for him to join them, there comes a letter saying that he cannot collect a proper force, and will therefore seek safety for the present in Scotland. That nevertheless he heartily wishes their heroic undertaking the best success. Thereupon they surrender to the king under a treaty which is not kept, and so perish. So far is the character from being the work of reasoned choice and consideration, that in any action the intellect has nothing to do but to present motives to the will. Thereafter it looks on as a mere spectator, a witness at the course of which life takes, in accordance with the influence of motive on the given character. All the incidents of life occur, strictly speaking, with the same necessity as the movement of a clock. On this point let me refer to my prize essay on the freedom of the will. I have there explained the true meaning and origin of the persistent illusion that the will is entirely free in every single action, and I have indicated the cause to which it is due. I will only add here the following teleological explanation of this natural illusion. Since every single action of a man's life seems to possess the freedom and originality in which the truth only belonged to his character as he apprehends it, and the mere apprehension of it by his intellect is what constitutes his career, and since what is original in every single action seems to be the empirical consciousness to be always being performed anew, a man thus receives in the course of his career the strongest possible moral lesson. Then, and not before, he becomes thoroughly conscious of all the bad sides of his character. conscience accompanies every act with the comment, "You should act differently," although its true sense is, "You could be other than you are." As the result of this immutability of character on the one hand, and on the other, of the strict necessity which attends all the circumstances in which character is successively placed, every man's course of life is precisely determined from alpha right through to omega. But nevertheless, one man's course of life turns out immeasurably happier, nobler, and more worthy than another's, whether it be regarded from a subjective or an objective point of view, and unless we are able to exclude ideas of justice, we are led to the doctrine which is well accepted in Brahmanism and Buddhism, that the subjective conditions in which, as well as the objective conditions under which, every man is born, are the moral consequence of previous existence.
Machiavelli, who seems to have taken no interest whatsoever in philosophical speculations, is drawn by the keen subtlety of his very unique understanding into the following observation, which possesses a really deep meaning. It shows that he had an intuitive knowledge of the entire necessity with which, characters and motives being given, all actions take place. He makes it at the beginning of the prologue to his comedy, Clitia. If he says the same men were to recur in the world in the way that the same circumstances recur, 100 years would never elapse without our finding ourselves together once more and doing the same things as we are doing now. He seems, however, to have been drawn into the remark by reminiscence of what Augustine says in De Civitae Dei. Again, fate, or the Greek imamene, of the ancients, is nothing but the conscious certainty that all that happens is fast bound by a chain of causes, and therefore takes place with a strict necessity, that the future is already ordained with absolute certainty and can undergo as little alteration as the past. In the fatalistic myths of the ancients, all that can be regarded as fabulous is the prediction of the future. That is, if we refuse to consider the possibility of magnetic clairvoyance and second sight. Instead of trying to explain away the fundamental truth of fatalism by superficial twaddle and foolish evasion, a man should attempt to get a clear knowledge and comprehension of it, for it is demonstrably true, and it helps us in a very important way to an understanding of the mysterious riddle of our life. Predestination and fatalism do not differ in the main. They differ only in this, that with predestination the given character and external determination of human action proceed from a rational being, and with fatalism from an irrational one. But in either case the result is the same. That happens which must happen. On the other hand, the conception of moral freedom is inseparable from that of originality. A man may be said, but he cannot be conceived, to be the work of another, and at the same time be free in respect of his desires and acts. He who called him into existence out of nothing in the same process created and determined his nature, for no one can create without creating something. That is to say, a being determined throughout and in all its qualities, for all that a man says and does necessarily proceeds from the qualities so determined, for it is only the qualities themselves set in motion. It is only some external impulse that they require to make their appearance. As a man is, so must he act, and praise or blame attaches, not to his separate acts, but to his nature and being. This is the reason why theism and the moral responsibility of man are incompatible, because responsibility always reverts to the creator of man, and it is that there is dissenter. Vain attempts have been made to make a bridge from one of these incompatibilities to the other means of conception of moral freedom, but it always breaks down again. What is free must also be original. If our will is free, our will is also the original element, and conversely. Pre-Kantian dogmatism tried to separate these two predicaments. It was thereby compelled to assume two kinds of freedom, one cosmological, of the first cause, and the other moral and theological, of human will. These are represented in Kant by the third, as well as the fourth, antinomy of freedom. On the other hand, in my philosophy the plain recognition of the strictly necessary character of all action is in accordance with the doctrine that what manifests itself, even in the organic and irrational world, is will. If it were not so, the necessity under which irrational beings obviously act would place their action in conflict with will, if, I mean, there were really such a thing as the freedom of individual action, and this were not as strictly necessitated as every other kind of action. But as I have just shown, it is in the same doctrine of the necessary character of all acts of will which makes it needful to regard a man's existence and being as itself the work of his freedom, and consequently of his will. The will therefore must be self-existent. It must possess so-called aseity. Under the opposite supposition, all responsibility, as I have shown, would be at an end, and the moral like the physical world would be a mere machine, set in motion for the amusement of its manufacturer, placed somewhere outside of it. So it is that truths hang together and mutually advance and complete one another, whereas error gets jostled at every corner. What kind of influence it is moral instruction may exercise on conduct, and what are the limits of that influence, are questions which I have sufficiently examined in the 20th section of my treatise on the foundation of morality. In all essential particulars, an analogous influence is exercised by example, which, however, has a more powerful effect than doctrine, and therefore it deserves a brief analysis. In the main, example works either by restraining a man or by encouraging him. It has the former effect when it determines him to leave undone what he wanted to do. He sees, that other people do not do it, and from this he judges, in general, that it is not expedient, that it may endanger his person or his property or his honour. He rests content and gladly finds himself relieved from examining into the matter for himself. Or he may see that another man, who has not refrained, has incurred evil consequences from doing it. This is example of the deterrent kind. The example which encourages a man works in a twofold manner. It either induces him to do what he would be glad to leave undone, if he were not afraid lest the omission might in some way endanger him, or injure him in others' opinion, or else it encourages him to do what he is glad to do, but has hitherto refrained from doing from fear of danger or shame. This is example of the seductive kind. Finally, example may bring a man to do what he would have otherwise never thought of doing. It is obvious that in this last case example works in the main only on the intellect. Its effect on the will is secondary, and if it has any such effect, it is by the interposition of the man's own judgment, or by reliance on the person who presented the example. The whole influence of example, and it is very strong, rests on the fact that a man has, as a rule, too little judgment of his own, and often too little knowledge, to explore his own way for himself, and that he is glad, therefore, to tread in the footsteps of someone else. Accordingly, the more deficient he is in either of these qualities, the more he is open to the influence of example, and we find, in fact, that most men's guiding star is the example of others, that their whole course of life, in great things and in small, comes in the end to be a mere imitation, and that not even the prettiest manners do they act according to their own judgment. Imitation and custom are the spring of almost all human action. The cause of it is that men fight shy of all and any sort of reflection, and very properly mistrust their own discernment. At the same time, this remarkably strong imitative instinct in a man is proof of his kinship with apes. But the kind of effect which example exercises depends upon a man's character, and thus it is the same example may possibly seduce one man to deter another. An easy opportunity of observing this is afforded in the case of a certain social impertinences which come into vogue and gradually spread. The first time that a man notices anything of the kind, he may say to himself, "For shame! How can he do it? How selfish and inconsiderate of him! Really, I shall take care and never do anything like that." But 20 others will think, "Aha! If he does it that way, I may do it too." As regards morality, example, like doctrine, may, it is true, promote civil or legal amelioration, but not that inward amendment which is, strictly speaking, the only kind of moral amelioration. For example always works as a personal motive alone, and assumes, therefore, that a man is susceptible to this sort of motive. But it is just the predominating sensitiveness of a character to this, or that sort of motive, that determines whether its morality is true and real, though, of whatever kind it is always innate. In general, it may be said that example operates as a means of promoting the good and the bad qualities of a character, but it does not create them. And so it is that Seneca's maxim, vel non disicatur, will cannot be learned, also holds good here. But the innateness of all truly moral qualities, of the good as of the bad, is a doctrine that consorts better with the metempsychosis of the Brahmins and Buddhists, according to which a man's good and bad deeds follow him from one existence to another like his shadow, than with Judaism. For Judaism requires a man to come into the world as a moral blank, so that, in virtue of an inconceivable free will, directed to objects which are neither to be sought nor avoided. Liberum arbitrium indifferentiae. And consequently, as the result of reasoned consideration, he may choose whether he is to be an angel or a devil, or anything else that may lie between the two. Though I am well aware what the Jewish scheme is, I pay no attention to it, for my standard is truth. I am no professor of philosophy, and therefore I do not find my vocation in establishing the fundamental ideas of Judaism at any cost, even though they forever bar the way to all and every kind of philosophical knowledge. Liberum arbitrium indifferentiae. Under the name of moral freedom is a charming doll for professors of philosophy to dandle, and we must leave it to those intelligent, honourable, and upright gentlemen. The Dilemma of Determinism, William James. A common opinion prevails that the justice has ages ago been pressed out of the free will controversy, and that no new champion can do more than warm up stale arguments which everyone has heard. This is a radical mistake. I know of no subject less worn out, or in which inventive genius has a better chance of breaking open a new ground. Not, perhaps, of forcing a conclusion or coercing assent, but of deepening our sense of what the issue between the two parties really is, of what the ideas of fate and free will imply. At our very side almost, in the past few years, we have seen falling in rapid succession from the press works that present the alternative in entirely novel lights. Not to speak of the English disciples of Hegel, such as Green and Bradley, not to speak of Hinton and Hodgson, nor of us Hazard here. We see in the writings of the Renouvier, Foulet, and Delboeuf how completely changed and refreshed is the form of all the old disputes. I cannot pretend to vie in originality with any of these masters I have named, and my ambition limits itself to just one little point. If I can make two of the necessarily implied corollaries of determinism clearer to you than you have been made before, I shall have made it possible for you to decide for or against that doctrine, with a better understanding of what you are about. If you prefer not to decide at all, but to remain doubters, you will at least see more plainly what the subject of your hesitation is. I thus disclaim openly on the threshold all pretension to prove to you that the freedom of will is true. The most I hope is to induce some of you to follow my own example in assuming it true, and acting as if it were true. If it be true, it seems to me that it is involved in the strict logic of the case. Its truth ought not to be forced willy-nilly down our indifferent throats. It ought to be freely espoused by men who can equally well turn their backs upon it. In other words, our first act of freedom, if we are free, ought in all inward propriety to be to affirm that we are free. This should exclude, it seems to me, from the free will side of the question, all hope of concierve demonstration, a demonstration which I, for one, am perfectly contented to go without. With thus much understood at the outset, we can advance, but not without one more point understood as well. The arguments I am about to urge all proceed on two suppositions. First, when we make theories about the world and discuss them with one another, we do so in order to attain a conception of things which shall give us subjective satisfaction. And second, if there be two conceptions, and the one seems to us, on the whole, more rational than the other, we are entitled to suppose that the more rational one is the truer of the two. I hope that you are willing to make these suppositions with me, for I am afraid that if there is any of you who are not, they will find little edification in the rest of what I have to say. I cannot stop to argue the point, but I myself believe that all the magnificent achievements of mathematical and physical science, our doctrines of evolution, of uniformity of law, and the rest, proceed from our indomitable desire to cast the world into a more rational shape in our minds than the shape into which it is thrown there by the crude order of our experience. The world has shown itself, to a great extent, plastic to this demand of ours for rationality. How much farther it will show itself plastic no one can say. Our only means of finding out is to try, and I, for one, feel as free to try conceptions of moral as of mechanical or logical rationality. If a certain formula for expressing the nature of the world violates my moral demand, I shall feel as free to throw it overboard, or at least to doubt it, as if it is to be disappointed my demand for uniformity of sequence. For example, the one demand being, so far as I can see, quite as subjective and emotional as the others. The principle of causality, for example. What is it but to postulate an empty name covering simply a demand that a sequence of events shall some day manifest a deeper kind of belonging of one thing with another than the mere arbitrary juxtaposition which now phenomenally appears? It is as much an altar to an unknown God as the one that St. Paul found at Athens. All our scientific and philosophic ideals are altars to unknown gods. Uniformity, inasmuch as so as it is free will. If this to be admitted, we can debate on even terms. But if anyone pretends that while freedom and variety are, in the first instance, subjective demands, necessity and the uniformity are something altogether different, I do not see how we can debate at all. To begin, then, I must suppose you are acquainted with all the usual arguments on the subject. I cannot stop to take up the old proofs for causation, from statistics, from the certainty with which we can foretell one another's conduct, from the fixity of character, and all the rest. But there are two words which usually encumber these classical arguments, and which we must immediately dispose of if we are to make any progress. One is the eulogistic word freedom, and the other is the opprobrious word chance. The word chance I wish to keep, but I wish to get rid of the word freedom. Its eulogistic associations have so far overshadowed all the rest of its meaning that both parties claim the sole right to use it, and determinists today insist that they alone are freedom's champions. Old-fashioned determinism was what we may call hard determinism. It did not shrink from such words as fatality, bondage of the will, necessitation, and the like. Nowadays we have a soft determinism, which abhors harsh words, and repudiating fatality, necessity, and even predetermination, says that its real name is freedom, for freedom is only necessity understood, and bondage to the highest is identical with true freedom. Even a writer as little used to making capital out of soft words as Mr. Hodgson hesitates not to call himself a free-will determinist. Now, all this is a quagmire of evasion under which the real issue of the fact has been entirely smothered. Freedom in all these senses presents simply no problem at all, no matter what the soft determinist means by it, whether he means the acting without external constraint, whether he means the acting rightly, or whether he means the acquiescing in the law of the whole. Who cannot answer him that sometimes we are free and sometimes we are not? But there is a problem, an issue of fact and not of words, an issue of the most momentous importance, which is often decided without discussion in one sentence, nay, in one clause of a sentence, by those very writers who spin out whole chapters in their efforts to show what true freedom is, and that is the question of determinism, about which we are to talk tonight. Fortunately, no ambiguities hang about this word or about its opposite, indeterminism. Both designate an outward way in which things may happen, and their cold and mathematical sound has no sentimental associations that can bribe our partiality either way in advance. Now, evidence of an external kind to decide between determinism and indeterminism is, as I intimated a while back, strictly impossible to find. Let us look at the difference between them and see for ourselves. What does determinism profess? It professes that those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely appoint and decree what the other parts shall be. The future has no ambiguous possibilities bidden in its womb. The part we call the present is compatible with only one totality. Any other future complement than the one fixed from eternity is impossible. The whole is in each and every part, and welds it with the rest into an absolute unity, an iron block, in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. With earth's first clay they did the last man knead, and there of the last harvest sowed the seed, and the first morning of creation wrote, what the last dawn of reckoning shall read. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says that the parts have a certain amount of loose play on one another, so that the laying down of one of them does not necessarily determine what the others shall be. It admits that possibilities may be in the excess of actualities, and that things not yet revealed to our knowledge may really in themselves be ambiguous. Of two alternative futures which we conceive, both may now be really possible, and the one becomes impossible only at the very moment when the other excludes it by becoming real itself. Indeterminism thus denies the world to be one unbending unit of fact. It says that there is a certain ultimate pluralism in it, and, so saying, it corroborates our ordinary unsophisticated view of things. To that view, actualities seem to float in a wider sea of possibilities from out which they are chosen. And somewhere, indeterminism says that such possibilities exist and form a part of truth. Determinism, on the contrary, says that they exist nowhere, and the necessity... Determinism, on the contrary, says they exist nowhere, and that necessity on the one hand and impossibility on the other are the sole categories of the real. Possibilities that fail to get realized are, for determinism, pure illusions. They never were possibilities at all. There is nothing inchoate, it says, about this universe of ours. All that was or is, or shall be, in it having been from eternity virtually there. The cloud of alternatives our minds escort this mass of actuality withal as a cloud of sheer deceptions, to which impossibilities is the only name that rightfully belongs. The issue, it will be seen, is a perfectly sharp one, with no eulogistic terminology can smear over or wipe out. The truth must lie with one side over the other, and its lying with one side makes the other false. The question relates solely to the existence of possibilities, in the strict sense of the term, as things that may, but need not be. Both sides admit that volition, for instance, has occurred. The indeterminists say another volition might have occurred in its place. The determinists swear that nothing could possibly have occurred in its place. Now, can science be called in to tell us which of these two point-blank contradictors of each other is right? Science professes to draw no conclusions, but such are based on matters of fact, things that have actually happened. But how can any amount of assurance that something actually happened give us the least grain of information as to whether another thing might or might not have happened in its place? Only facts can be proved by other facts. With things that are possibilities and not facts, facts have no concern. If we have no other evidence than the evidence of existing facts, the possibility question must remain a mystery, never to be cleared up. And the truth is that facts practically have hardly anything to do with making us either determinists or indeterminists. Sure enough, we make a flourish of quoting facts, this way or that. And if we are determinists, we talk about the infallibility in which we can predict on one another's conduct. While if we are determinists, we lay great stress on the fact that it is just because we cannot foretell one another's conduct, either in war or statecraft, or in any of the great and small intrigues and the business of men, that life is so intensely anxious and hazardous a game. But who does not see the wretched insufficiency of this in so-called objective testimony on both sides? What fills up the gaps in our minds is something not objective, not external. What divides us into possibility men and anti-possibility men is different faiths, or postulates of rationality. To this man the world seems more rational with possibilities in it. To that man more rational with possibilities excluded, and talk as we will about having to yield to evidence. What makes us monists or plurists, determinists or indeterminists, is at a bottom always some sentiment like this. The stronghold of the deterministic sentiment is the antipathy to the idea of chance. As soon as we begin to talk about indeterminism to our friends, we find a number of them shaking their heads. This notion of alternative possibilities, they say, this admission that one of many several things may come to pass, is, after all, only a roundabout name for chance. And chance is something, the notion, which no sane mind can for an instant tolerate in the world. What is it, they ask, but barefaced crazy unreason, the negation of the intelligibility and law? And if the slightest particle of it exists anywhere, what is to prevent the whole fabric from falling together, the stars from going out, and chaos from recommencing her topsy-turvy reign? Remarks of this sort about chance will put an end to discussion as quickly as anything one can find. I have already told you that chance was a word I wish to keep and use. Let us then examine exactly what it means, and see whether it ought to be such a terrible bugbear to us. I fancy that squeezing this thistle boldly will rob it of its sting. The sting of the word chance seems to lie in the assumption that it means something positive, and that if anything happens by chance, it must needs be something of an intrinsically irrational and preposterous sort. Now, chance means nothing of the kind. It is a purely negative and relative term, giving us no information about that of which it is predicted, except that it happens to be disconnected with something else, not controlled, secured, or necessitated by other things in advance of its own actual presence. As this point is the most subtle one of the whole lecture, and at the same time the point on which all the rest hinges, I beg you to pay particular attention to it. What I say is that it tells us nothing about what a thing may be in itself to call it chance. It may be a bad thing, it may be a good thing. It may be lucidity, transparency, fitness incarnate, matching the whole system of other things when it has once befallen, in an unimaginably perfect way. All you mean by calling it chance is that it is not guaranteed, that it may also fall out otherwise. But the system of other things has no positive hold on the chance thing. Its origin is in a certain fashion negative. It escapes and says, hands off. Coming, when it comes, as a free gift, or not at all. The negativeness, however, and this opacity of the chance thing, when thus considered ab extra, or from the point of view of previous things or distant things, do not preclude its having any amount of positiveness and luminosity from within, and at its own place and moment. All that its chance character asserts about it is that there is something in it really of its own, something that is not the unconditional property of the whole. If the whole wants this property, the whole must wait until it can get it, if it be a matter of chance. That the universe may actually be a sort of joint stock society of this sort, in which the share is of both limited liabilities and limited powers, is of course a simple and conceivable notion. Nevertheless, many persons talk as if it is the minutest dose of disconnectedness of one part with another, the smallest modicum of independence. The faintest tremor of ambiguity about the future, for example, would ruin everything, and turn this goodly universe into a sort of insane sand-heap of nulliverse, no universe at all. Since future human volitions are as a matter of fact the only ambiguous things we are tempted to believe in, let us stop for a moment to make ourselves sure whether their independent or accidental character need be fraught with such direful consequences to the universe as these. What is meant by saying that my choice of which way to walk home after this lecture is ambiguous and matter of chance, as far as the present moment is concerned? It means that both Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street are called, but that only one, and that one either one, shall be chosen. Now I ask you seriously to suppose that this ambiguity of my choice is real, and then to make the impossible hypothesis that the choice is made twice over, and each time falls on a different street. In other words, imagine that I first walk through Divinity Avenue, and then imagine that the powers governing the universe annihilate 10 minutes of time with all that it contained, and set me back at the door of this hall, just as I was before the choice was made. Imagine then that everything else being the same, I now make a different choice, and traverse Oxford Street. You are passive spectators. Look on and see how two alternative universes, one of them with me walking down Divinity Avenue in it, the other with the same me walking through Oxford Street. Now, if you were determinists, you believe one of these universes to have been from eternity impossible. You believe it to have been impossible because of the intrinsic irrationality or accidentality somewhere involved in it. But looking outwardly at these universes, can you say which is the impossible and the accidental one, and which the rational and necessary one? I doubt if the most ironclad determinist among you could have the slightest glimmer of light on this point. In other words, either universe after the fact, and once there would, to our means of observation and understanding, appear just as rational as the other. There would be absolutely no criterion by which we might judge one necessary and the other matter of chance. Suppose now we relieve the gods of their hypothetical task and assume my choice, once made, to be made forever. I go through Divinity Avenue for good and all. If, as good determinists, you now begin to affirm what all good determinists punctually do affirm, that in the nature of things I couldn't have gone through Oxford Street. Had I done so, it would have been chance, irrationality, insanity, a horrid gap in nature. I simply call your attention to this, that your affirmation is what the Germans call a Marschspruch, a mere conception fulminated as a dogma and based on no insight into detail. Before my choice, either street seemed as natural to you as to me. Had I happened to take Oxford Street, Divinity Avenue would have figured in your philosophy as the gap in nature, and you would have so proclaimed it with the best deterministic conscience in the world. But what a hollow outcry, then, is this against a chance which, if it were presented to us, we could by no character whatever distinguish from a rational necessity. I have taken the most trivial of examples, but no possible example could lead to any different result. For what are the alternatives which, in point of fact, offer themselves to a human volition? What are those futures that no seem matters of chance? Are they not one and all like the Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street of our example? Are they not all of them kinds of things already here and based on the existing frame of nature? Is anyone ever tempted to produce an absolute accident, something utterly irrelevant to the rest of the world? Do not, and the motives that assail us, all the futures that offer themselves to our choice, spring equally from the soil of the past? And wouldn't either of them, whether realized through chance or through necessity, the moment it was realized, seem to us to fit the past, and in the completest and most continuous manner to interrogate with the phenomena already there? The more one thinks of the matter, the more one wonders that so empty and gratuitous of the hubbub as the outcry against chance should have found so great an echo in the hearts of men. It is a word which really tells us nothing about what chance is, or about what the modus operandi of the chancing. And the use of it as a war cry shows only a temper of intellectual absolutism, a demand that the world shall be a solid block, subject to one control. Which temper, which demand, the world may not be found to gratify at all. In every outwardly verifiable and practical respect, a world with the alternatives that now actually distract your choice were decided by pure chance would be in me absolutely undistinguished from the world in which I now live. I am, therefore, entirely willing to call it, so far as your choices go, a world of chance for me. To yourselves, it is true. Those very acts of choice which to me are so blind, opaque, and external are the opposites of this, for you are within them and affect them. To you they appear as decisions, and decisions. For him who makes them are altogether peculiar psychic facts. Self-luminous and self-justifying at the living moment at which they occur, they appeal to no outside moment, to put its stamp upon them or make them continuous with the rest of nature. Themselves it is rather who seem to make nature continuous, and in their strange and intense function of granting consent to one possibility and withholding it from another, to transform an equivocable and double future into an unalterable and simple past. But with the psychology of the matter we have no concern this evening. The quarrel which determinism has with that chance fortunately has nothing to do with this or the psychological detail. It is a quarrel altogether metaphysical. Determinism denies the ambiguity of future volitions because it affirms that nothing future can be ambiguous, but we have said enough to meet the issue. Indeterminate future volitions do mean chance. Let us not fear to shout it from the housetops if need be, for we know that the idea of chance is at bottom exactly the same thing as the idea of gift, the one simply being a disparaging and the other a eulogistic name for anything on which we have no effective claim. And whether the world will be better or worse for having either chances or gifts in it will depend altogether on what these uncertain and unclaimable things turn out to be. And this at last brings us within sight of our subject. We have seen what determinism means. We have seen that indeterminism is rightly described as meaning chance, and we have seen that chance, the very name of which we are urged to shrink from as from a metaphysical pestilence, means only the negative fact that no part of the world, however big, can claim to control absolutely the destinies of the whole. But although, in discussing the word chance, I may at moments have seemed to be arguing for its real existence, I have not meant to do so yet. We have not yet ascertained whether this be a world of chance or no. At most, we have agreed that it seems so. And I now repeat what I said at the outset, that, from any strict theoretical point of view, the question is insoluble. To deepen our theoretic sense of the difference between a world with chances in it and a deterministic world is the most I can hope to do. And this I may now at least begin upon, after all our tedious clearing of the way. I wish first of all to show you just what the notion that is a deterministic world implies. The implications I call your attention to are all bound up with the fact that it is a world in which we constantly have to make what I shall, with your permission, call judgments of regret. Hardly an hour passes in which we do not wish that something might be otherwise, and happy indeed are those of us whose hearts have never echoed the wish of Omar Khayyam. That we might clasp ere closed the book of fate, and make the writer, on a fair relief, inscribe our names or quite obliterate. Ah, love, could you and I with fate conspire to mend this story scheme of things entire? Would we not shatter it to bits, and then remould it never to be the heart's desire? Now it is undeniable that most of these regrets are foolish, and quite on par in point of philosophic value with the criticisms on the universe of that friend of our infancy, the hero of the fable, the atheist of the acorn. Fool, had that buff a pumpkin bore, thy whimsies would have worked no more, etc. Even from the point of view of our own ends, we should probably make a botch of remodelling the universe. How much more, then, from the point of view of ends we cannot see? Wise men therefore regret as little as they can, but still some regrets are pretty obstinate, and hard to stifle. Regrets for acts of wanton cruelty or treachery, for example, whether performed by others or by ourselves. Hardly anyone can remain entirely optimistic about reading the confession of the murderer, Brockton, the other day. How to get rid of the wife whose continued existence bored him. He inveigled her into a deep desert spot, shot her 4 times, and then, as she lay on the ground and said to him, "You didn't do it on purpose, did you, dear?" replied, "No, I didn't do it on purpose," as he raised a rock and smashed her skull. Such an occurrence with the mild sentence and self-satisfaction of the prisoner is a field for a crop of regrets, which one need not take up in detail. We feel that although a perfect mechanical fit to the rest of the universe, it is a bad moral fit, and that something else would really have been in better place. It is a bad moral fit, and that something else would really have been better in its place. But for the deterministic philosophy, the murderer, the sentence, and the prisoner's optimism were all necessary, from eternity, and nothing else for a moment had a ghost of a chance of being put in their place. To admit such a chance, the determinists tell us, will be able to make a suicide of reason. So we must steel our hearts against the thought. And here our plot thickens, for we see the first choice of those difficult implications of deterministic monism, which is my purpose to make you feel. If this Brockton murder was called for by the rest of the universe, if it had to come as a pre-pointed hour, and if nothing else would have been consistent with the sense of the whole, what are we to think of the universe? Are we stubbornly to stick to our judgment of regret and say, though it couldn't be, yet it would have been a better universe with something different from this Brockton murder in it? That, of course, seems the natural and spontaneous thing for us to do, and yet is nothing of the sort of deliberately espousing a kind of pessimism. The judgment of regret calls the murder bad. Calling a thing bad means, if it means anything at all, that the thing ought not to be, that something else ought to be in its stead. Determinism is denying that everything else can be in its stead, virtually defines the universe as a place in which we ought to be impossible. In other words, as an organism whose constitution is afflicted with an incurable taint. The pessimism of Schopenhauer says no more than this, that the murder is a symptom, and that it is a vicious symptom because it belongs to a vicious whole, which can express its nature no otherwise than by bringing forth just such a symptom as this particular spot. Regret for the murder must transform itself, if we are determinists and wise, into a larger regret. It is absurd to regret the murder alone. Otherwise, things being what they are, it could not be different. What we should regret is that the whole frame of things of which the murder is one member. I see no escape whatsoever from this pessimistic conclusion if, being determinists, our judgment of regret is to be allowed to stand at all. The only deterministic escape from pessimism is everywhere to abandon the judgment of regret. That this can be done, history shows to be not impossible. The devil, quod existiam, may be good. That is, although he be a principle of evil, yet the universe, with such a principle in it, may practically be a better universe than it could have been without. On every hand, in a small way, we find that a certain amount of evil is a condition by which a higher form of good is brought. There is nothing to prevent anybody from generalizing this view and trusting that if we could but see things in the largest of all ways, even if such matters as this Brockton murder would appear to be paid for by the uses that follow in their train. An optimism, quod meum, a systematic and infatuated optimism like that ridiculed by Voltaire in his Candide, is one of the possible ideal ways in which a man may train himself to look on life. Bereft of dogmatic hardness, and lit up with the expression of a tender and pathetic hope, Such an optimism has been a grace of some sort of the most religious characters that have ever lived. Throb thine with nature's throbbing breast, and all is clear from east to west. Even cruelty and treachery may be among the absolutely blessed fruits of time, and to quarrel with any of their details may be blasphemy. The only real blasphemy, in short, may be that pessimistic temper of the soul which lets it give way to such things as regrets, remorse, and grief. Thus our deterministic pessimism may become a deterministic optimism at the price of extinguishing our judgments of regret. But does this not immediately bring us into a curious logical predicament? Our determinism leads us to call our judgment of regret wrong, because they are pessimistic in implying that what is impossible yet ought to be. But how, then, about the judgment of regret themselves? If they are wrong, other judgments, judgments of approval, presumably, ought to be in their place. But as they are necessitated, nothing else can be in their place, and the universe is just what it was before, namely, a place in which we ought to be appears impossible. We have got one foot out of the pessimistic bog, but the other one sinks all the deeper. We have rescued our actions from the bonds of evil, but our judgments are now held fast. When murders and treacheries cease to be sins, regrets are theoretic absurdities and errors. The theoretic and the active life thus plays a kind of seesaw with each other on the ground of evil. The rise of either sends the other down. Murder and treachery cannot be good without regret being bad. The regret cannot be good without treachery and murder being bad. Both, however, are supposed to have been foredoomed, so something must be fatally unreasonable, absurd, and wrong in the world. It must be a place of which either sin or error forms a necessary part. From this dilemma there seems at first sight no escape. Are we then so soon to fall back into the pessimism from which we thought we had emerged? And is there no possible way by which we may, with good intellectual consciences, call the cruelties and treacheries, the reluctances and the regrets, all good together? Certainly there is such a way, and you are probably most of you ready to formulate it yourselves. But before doing so, remark how inevitably the question of determinism and indeterminism slides us into the question of optimism and pessimism, or, as our fathers called it, the question of evil. The theological form of all of these disputes is the simplest and the deepest, the form from which there is at least escape not, because, as some have sarcastically said, remorse and regret are clung to us with a morbid fondness by the theologians as spiritual luxuries, but because they are existing facts of the world, and as such must be taken into account in the deterministic interpretation of all that is fated to be. If they are fated to be error, does not the bat's wing of irrationality still cast its shadow over the world? The refuge from the quandary lies, as I said, not far off. The necessary acts we erroneously regret may be good, and yet our error in so regretting them may be also good on one simple condition, and that condition is this: the world must not be regarded as a machine whose final purpose is making the real of any outward good, but rather as a contrivance for deepening the theoretic consciousness of what goodness and evil in their intrinsic natures are. Not the doing of either good or evil is what nature cares for, but the knowing of them. Life is one long eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. I am in the habit in thinking to myself of calling this point of view the Gnostical point of view. According to it, the world is neither an optimism nor a pessimism, but a Gnosticism. But as this term may perhaps lead to some misunderstandings, I will use it as little as possible here, and speak rather of subjectivism, and the subjectivistic point of view. Subjectivism has three great branches. We may call them scientifism, sentimentalism, and sensualism, respectively. They all agree essentially about the universe, in deeming that what happens there is subsidiary to what we think or feel about. Crime justifies its criminality by awakening our intelligence of that criminality, and eventually our remorses and regrets, and the error included in remorses and regrets. The error of supposing that the past could have been different justifies itself by its use. Its use is to quicken our sense of what the irretrievably lost is. When we think of it as that which might have been, the saddest words of the tongue or pen, the quality of its worth speaks to us with a wilder sweetness. and conversely the dissatisfaction wherewith we think what seems to have driven it from its natural place gives us the severer pang. Admirable artifice of nature. We might be tempted to exclaim, deceiving us in order to better enlighten us, and leaving nothing undone to accentuate to our consciousness the yawning distance of those opposite poles of good and evil, between which creation swings. We have thus clearly revealed to our view what may be called the dilemma of determinism, so far as determinism pretends to think things out at all. A merely mechanical determinism, it is true, rather rejoices its not thinking them out. It is very sure that the universe must satisfy its postulate of a physical continuity and coherence, but it smiles at anyone who comes forward with the postulate of moral coherence as well. I may suppose, however, that the number of purely mechanical or hard determinists among you this evening is small. The determinism to whose seductions you are most exposed is what I have called soft determinism. The determinism which allows considerations of good and bad to mingle with those of cause and effect in deciding what sort of a universe this may rationally be held to be. The dilemma of this determinism is one whose left horn is pessimism and whose right horn is subjectivism. In other words, if determinism is to escape pessimism, it must leave off looking at the goods and ills of life in a simple objective way and regard them as materials, indifferent in themselves, for the production of consciousness, scientific and ethical, in us. To escape pessimism, as we all know, is not an easy task. Your own studies have sufficiently shown you the almost desperate difficulty of making the notion that there is a single principle of things, and that principle is absolute perfection, rhyme together with our daily vision of the facts of life. If perfection be the principle, how comes there's any imperfection here? If God be good, how came to create, or, if he did not create, how come he to permit the devil? The evil facts must be explained as seeming. The devil must be whitewashed. The universe must be disinfected, if neither God's goodness nor his unity and power to remain impugned. Of all the various ways of operating the disinfection and making bad seem less bad, the way of subjectivism appears by far the best. For, after all, is there not something rather absurd in our ordinary notion of external things being good or bad in themselves? Can murders and treacheries, considered as mere outward happenings or motions of matter, be bad without anyone to feel their badness? And could paradise properly be good in the absence of a sentiment principle by which the goodness was perceived? Outward goods and evils seem practically indistinguishable, except in so far as they result in getting moral judgments made about them. But then the moral judgments seem the main thing, and the outward facts mere perishing instruments for their production. This is subjectivism. Everyone must at some time have wondered at the strange paradox of our moral nature, that, though the pursuit of outward good is the breath of its nostrils, the attainment of outward good would seem to be its suffocation and death. Why does the painting of any paradise or utopia in heaven or on earth awaken such yawnings from nirvana and escape? The white-robed harp-playing heaven of our Sabbath schools and the ladylike tea-table Elysium represented in Mr. Spencer's Data of Ethics as the final consummation of progress are exactly on par in this respect. Loverlands, pure and simple one and all. We look upon them from this delicious mess of insanities and realities, strivings and deadnesses, hopes and fears, agonies and exultations, which forms our present state, and tedium vitae is the only sentiment that awaken in our breasts. To our crepuscular natures born for the conflict, the Rembrandtesque moral, the shifting struggle of the sunbeam in the gloom, such pictures of light upon light are vacuous and expressionless, and neither to be enjoyed nor understood. If this is to be the whole fruit of the victory, we say, if the generations of mankind suffered and laid down their lives, if prophets confessed and martyrs sang in their fire, and all the sacred tears were shed for no other end than that a race of creatures of such an exampled insipidity should succeed and protract in secularum their contented and inoffensive lives. Why at such a rate better lose than win the battle, or at all events better ring down the curtain before the last act of the play, so that a business that began so importantly may be saved from so singularly flat a winding up. All this is what I should instantly say were I called on to plead for Gnosticism and its real friends, of whom you will presently perceive I am not one, would say without difficulty a great deal more. Regarded as a stable finality, every outward good becomes a mere weariness to the flesh. It must be menaced, be occasionally lost for its goodness to be fully felt as such, nay, more than occasionally lost. No one knows the worth of innocence till he knows it is gone forever, and that money cannot buy it back. Nor the saint. Not the saint, but the sinner that repenteth is he to whom the full length and breadth and height and depth of life's meaning is revealed. Not the absence of vice, but vice there, and virtue holding her by the throat, seems the ideal human state. And there seems no reason to suppose it is not a permanent human state. There is a deep truth in what the school of Schopenhauer insists on, the illusoriness of the notion of moral progress. The moral, brutal forms of evil that go are replaced by others more subtle and more poisonous. Our moral horizon moves with us as we move, and never do we draw nearer to the far-off line where the black waves and the azure meet. The final purpose of our creation seems most plausibly to be the greatest possible enrichment of our ethical consciousness, through the intensest play of contrasts and the widest diversity of characters. This, of course, obliges some of us to be vessels of wrath, while it calls others to be vessels of honour. But the subjectivist point of view reduces all of these outward distinctions to a common denominator. The wretch languishing in the felon's cell may be drinking draughts of the wine of truth that will never pass the lips of the so-called favourite of fortune. And the peculiar consciousness of each of them is an indispensable note in the great ethical concert which the centuries as they roll are grinding out of the living heart of man. So much for subjectivism. If the dilemma of determinism be to choose between it and pessimism, I see little room for hesitation from the strictly theoretical point of view. Subjectivism seems the more rational scheme, and the world may possibly, for aught I know, be nothing else. When the healthy love of life is on one, and all its forms and appetites seem so unutterably true, when the most brutal and the most spiritual things are lit by the same sun, and each is an integral part of the total richness, why, then, it seems a grudging and stickly way of meeting so robust a universe to shrink from any of its facts and wish them not to be. Rather take the strictly dramatic point of view, and treat the whole thing as a great unending romance with the spirit of the universe, striving to realize its own content, is eternally thinking out and representing to itself. No one, I hope, will accuse me, after I have said all this, of underrating the reasons in favour of subjectivism. And now that I proceed to say what those reasons, strong as they are, failed to convince my own mind, I trust the presumption may be that my objections are stronger still. I frankly confess that they are of practical order. If we practically take up subjectivism in a sincere and radical manner and follow its consequences, we meet with some that make us pause. Let a subjectivism begin in never so severe and intellectual a way. It is forced by the law of its nature to develop another side of itself, and end with the corrupter's curiosity. Once dismiss the notion that certain duties are good in themselves and that we are here to do them. Once consecrate the opposite notion that our performances and our violations of duty are for a common purpose, the attainment of subjective knowledge and feeling, and that the deepening of these is the chief end of our lives. And at what point on the downward slope are we to stop? In theology, subjectivism develops as its left wing, antinomianism. In literature, its left wing is romanticism, and in practical life it is either a nerveless sentimentality or sensualism without bounds. Everywhere it fosters the fatalistic mood of mind. It makes those who are already too inert more passive still. It renders wholly reckless those whose energy is already in excess. All through history we find how subjectivism, as soon as it has a free career, exhausts itself in every sort of spiritual, moral, and practical license. Its optimism turns to an ethical indifference, which infallibly brings dissolution in its train. It is perfectly safe to say now that if the Hegelian Gnosticism, which has begun to show itself here and in Great Britain, were to become a popular philosophy, as it was once in Germany, it would certainly develop its left wing here as there, and produce a reaction of disgust. Already I have heard a graduate of this very school express in the pulpit his willingness to sin like David, if only he might repent like David. You may tell me he was only sowing his wild, or rather his tame oats, and perhaps he was. But the point is that the subjective or gnostical philosophy of oat sowing, wild or tame, becomes a systematic necessity and the chief function of life. After the pure and classic truths, the exciting and rancid ones must be experienced, and if the stupid virtues in the Philistine herd do not come in and save society from the influence of the children of light, a sort of inward putrefaction becomes its inevitable doom. Look at the last runnings of the Romantic school as we see them in the strange contemporary Parisian literature, with which we of less clever countries are so often driven to rinse out of our minds after they have become clogged with the dullness and heaviness of our native pursuits. The Romantic school began with the worship of subjective sensibility and the revolt against legality, of which Rousseau was his first great prophet, and through various fluxes and refluxes, right wings and left wings, with two men of genius, M. Renan and M. Zola, as its principal exponents, one speaking with its masculine and the other with what might be called its feminine voice. I prefer not to think now of less noble members of the school, and the Renan I have in mind is, of course, the Renan of later dates. As I have used the term Gnostic, both he and Zola are Gnostics of the most pronounced sort. Both are athirst for the facts of life, and both think the facts of human sensibility to be all the facts the most worthy of attention. Both agree, moreover, that sensibility seems to be there for no higher purpose. Certainly not, as the Philistines say, for the sake of bringing mere outward rights to pass and frustrating outward wrongs. One dwells on the sensibilities for their energy, the other for their sweetness. One speaks with the voice of bronze, the other with that of an aeolian harp. One ruggedly ignores the distinction of good and evil, the other plays the coquette between the craven unmanliness of his philosophic dialogues and the butterfly optimism of his souvenirs de jeunesse. But under the pages of both there sounds incessantly the hoarse bass of vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas, which the reader may hear whenever he will between the lines. No writer of this French Romantic school has a word of rescue from the hour of satiety with the things of life, the hour in which we say, I take no pleasure in them, or from the hour of terror, the world's vast meaningless grinding, if perchance such hour should come. For terror and satiety are facts of sensibility like any others, and at their own hour they reign in their own right. The heart of the romantic utterances, whether poetical, critical, or historical, is this inward remedialessness, what Carlyle calls this far-off whimpering of wail and woe. And from this romantic state of mind there is absolutely no possible theoretic escape. Whether, like Renan, we look up on life in a more refined way as a romance of the spirit, or whether, like the friends of M. Zola, we pique ourselves on our scientific and analytic character, and prefer to be cynical, and call the world a Roman experimental on an infinite scale. In either case the world appears to us potentially as what the same Carlyle once called it, a vast, gloomy, solitary Golgotha and mill of death. The only escape is by the practical way, and since I have mentioned the nowadays much reviled name of Carlyle, let me mention it once more, and say it is the way of his teaching. No matter of Carlyle's life, no matter for a great deal of his writing, what was the most important thing he said to us? He said, hang your sensibilities, stop your snivelling complaints, and your equally snivelling raptures. Leave off your general, emotional tomfoolery, and get to work like men. But this means a complete rupture with the subjectivist philosophy of things. It says conduct, and not sensibility, is the ultimate fact for our recognition. With the vision of certain works to be done, of certain outward changes to be wrought or resisted, it says our intellectual horizon terminates. No matter how we succeed in doing these outward duties, whether gladly or spontaneously, or heavily and unwillingly, do them we somehow must, for the leaving of them undone is perdition. No matter how we feel, if we are only faithful in the outward act and refuse to do wrong, the world will in so far be safe, and we quit our debt toward it. Take, then, the yoke upon our shoulders. Bend our neck beneath the heavy legality of its weight. Regard something else than our feeling as our limit, our master and our law. Be willing to live and die in its service, and, at a stroke, we have passed from the subjective into the objective philosophy of things, much as one awakens from some feverish dream, full of bad lights and noises, to find oneself bathed in the sacred coolness and quiet of the air of the night. But what is the essence of this philosophy of objective conduct so old-fashioned and finite, but so chaste and sane and strong, when compared with its romantic rival? It is the recognition of limits, foreign and opaque to our understanding. It is the willingness, after bringing about some external good, to feel at peace, for our responsibility ends with the performance of that duty, and the burden of the rest we may lay on higher powers. Look to thyself, O universe, thou art better and not worse. We may say it, that philosophy, the moment we have done our stroke of conduct, however small. For in the view of that philosophy the universe belongs to a plurality of semi-independent forces, each one of which may help or hinder, and be helped or hindered by the operations of the rest. But this brings us right back, after such a long detour, to the question of indeterminism, and to the conclusion of all I came here to say tonight. For the only consistent way of representing a pluralism, and a world whose parts may affect one another through their conduct being either good or bad, is the indeterministic way. What interest, zest, or excitement can there be in achieving the right way, unless we are enabled to feel that the wrong way is also possible, and a natural way, nay, more a menacing and imminent way? And what sense can there be in condemning ourselves for taking the wrong way, unless we need to have done nothing of the sort, unless the right way was open to us as well? I cannot understand the willingness to act, no matter how we feel, without the belief that acts are really good and bad. I cannot understand the belief that an act is bad without regret at it happening. I cannot understand the regret without the admission of real, genuine possibilities in the world. Only then is it other than a mockery to feel, after we had failed to do our best, that an irreparable opportunity is gone from the universe, the loss of which it must forever and after mourn. If you insist that this is all superstition, that possibility is in the eye of science and reason impossibility, and that if I act badly, 'tis that the universe was foredoomed to suffer this defect, you fall right back into the dilemma, the labyrinth of pessimism and subjectivism, from out of whose toils we have just found our way. Now we are of course free to fall back if we please. For my own part, though, whatever difficulties may beset the philosophy of objective right and wrong, and the indeterminism it seems to imply, determinism, with its alternative of pessimism, of romanticism, contains difficulties that are greater still. But you will remember that I expressly repudiated a while ago the pretension to offer any arguments which could be coercive in a so-called scientific fashion in this matter, and I consequently find myself at the end of this long talk obliged to state my conclusions in an altogether personal way. This personal method of appeal seems to be among the very conditions of the problem, and the most anyone can do is to confess as candidly as he can the grounds for the faith that is in him, and leave his example to work on others as it may. Let me then, without circumlocution, say just this. The world is enigmatical enough in all conscience, whatever theory we may take toward it. The indeterminism I defend, the free will theory of popular sense based on the judgment of regret, represents that world as vulnerable, and liable to be injured by certain of its parts if they act wrong. And it presents their acting wrong as a matter of possibility or accident, neither inevitable nor yet to be infallibly warded off. In all this, it is a theory devoid either of transparency or of stability. It gives us a pluralistic, restless universe in which no single point of view can ever take the whole scene, and to a mind possessed of the love of unity at any cost, it will no doubt remain forever unacceptable. A friend with such a mind once told me that the thought of my universe made him sick, like the sight of the horrible motion of a mass of maggots in their carrion bed. But while I freely admit that the pluralism and the restlessness are repugnant and irrational in a certain way, I find that every alternative to them is irrational in a deeper way. The indeterminism, with its maggots, if you please to speak so about it, offends only the native absolutism of my intellect, an absolutism which, after all, perhaps deserves to be snubbed and kept in check. But the determinism with its necessary Karayan, to continue the figure of speech and with no possible maggots to eat the latter up, violates my sense of moral reality through and through. When, for example, I imagine such Karayan at the Brockton murder, I cannot conceive it as an act by which the universe as a whole logically and necessarily expresses its nature, without shrinking from complicity with such a whole. And I deliberately refuse to keep on terms of loyalty with the universe by saying blankly that the murder, since it does not flow from the nature of the whole, is not Karayan. There are some instinctive reactions which I, for one, will not tamper with. The only remaining alternative, the attitude of Gnostical romanticism, wrenches my personal instincts in quite as violent a way. It falsifies the simple objectivity of their deliverance. It makes the goose-flesh the murder excites in me a sufficient reason for the perpetration of the crime. It transforms life from a tragic reality into an insincere melodramatic exhibition, as foul or as tawdry as anyone's diseased curiosity pleases to carry it out. And with its consecration of the Roman naturalist state of mind, and its enthronement of the baser crew of the Parisian littérateurs, among the eternally indispensable organs by which the infinite spirit of things attains to that subjective illumination which is the task of its life, it leaves me in the presence of a sort of subjective Karayan considerably more noisome than the subjective Karayan I call it to take away. No, better 1,000 times than such systematic corruption of our moral sanity, the plainest pessimism so that it might be straightforward, but better far than the world of chance. Make as great an uproar about chance as you please. I know that chance means pluralism, and nothing more. If some of the members of the pluralism are bad, the philosophy of the pluralism, whatever broad views it may deny me, permits me at least to turn to the other members with a clean breast of affection and an unsophisticated moral sense. And if I still wish to think of the world as a totality, it lets me feel that a world with a chance in it of being altogether good, even if the chance never come to pass, is a better than a world with no such chance at all. That chance whose very notion I am exhorted and conjured to banish from my view of the future as the suicide of reason concerning it, that chance is what? Just this, the chance that in moral respects the future may be other and better than the past has been. This is the only chance we have in any motive for supposing to exist. Shame, rather, on its repudiation and its denial. For its presence is the vital air which lets the world live, the salt which keeps it sweet. And here I might legitimately stop, having expressed all I care to see admitted by others tonight. But I know that if I do stop here, misapprehensions will remain in the minds of some of you, and keep all I have said from having its effect, so I judge it best to add a few more words. In the first place, in spite of all my explanations, the word chance will still be giving trouble. Though you may yourselves be adverse to the deterministic doctrine, you, with a pleasanter word than chance to name the opposite doctrine by, and you very likely consider my preference for such a word a perverse sort of partiality on my part. It certainly is a bad word to make converts with, and you wish I had not thrust it so butt foremost at you. You wish to use a milder term. Well, I admit there may be just a dash of perversity in its choice. The spectacle of the mere word-grabbing game played by the soft determinists has perhaps driven me too violently the other way, and rather than be found wrangling with them for the good words, I am willing to take the first bad one which comes along, provided it be unequivocal. The question is of things, not of eulogistic names for them, and the best word is the one that enables men to know the quickest whether they disagree or not about the things. But the word chance, with its singular negativity, is just the word for this purpose. Whoever uses it instead of freedom squarely and resolutely gives up all pretense to control the things he says are free, For him he confesses that they are no better than mere chance would be. It is a word of impotence, and is therefore the only sincere word we can use, if in it granting freedom to certain things we grant it honestly, and really risk the game. Who chooses me must give and forfeit all he hath. Any other word permits of quibbling, and lets us, after the fashion of the softest determinists, make a pretence of restoring the caged bird to liberty with one hand, while with the other we anxiously tie a string to its leg to make sure it does not go beyond our sight. But now you will bring up your final doubt. Does not the admission of such an unguaranteed chance or freedom preclude utterly the notion of a providence governing the world? Does it not leave the fate of the universe at the mercy of the chance possibilities, and so far insecure? Does it not, in short, deny the craving of our nature for an ultimate peace behind all tempests, for a blue zenith above all clouds? To this my answer must be very brief. The belief in free will is not the least incompatible with the belief in providence. To this my answer must be very brief. The belief in free will is not in the least incompatible with the belief in providence, provided you do not restrict the providence to fulminating nothing but fatal degrees. If you allow him to provide possibilities as well as actualities to the universe, and to carry on his own thinking in these two categories just as we do ours, chances may be there, uncontrolled even by him, and the course of the universe be really ambiguous, and yet the end of all things may just be what intended it to be from all eternity. An analogy will make the meaning of this clear. Suppose two men before a chessboard, the one a novice, the other an expert player of the game. The expert intends to beat, but he cannot foresee exactly what any one actual move his adversary may make. He knows, however, all the possible moves of the latter, and he knows in advance how to meet each of them by a move of his own, which leads in the direction of victory. And the victory infallibly arrives, after no matter how devious a course, in the one predestined form of checkmate to the novice's king. Let now the novice stand for us finite free agents, and the expert for the infinite mind in which the universe lies. Suppose the latter to be thinking out his universe before he actually creates it. Suppose him to say, I will lead things to a certain end, but I will not now decide on all the steps thereto. At various points ambiguous possibilities shall be left open, either of which at a given instant may become actual. But whichever branch of these bifurcations becomes real, I know what I shall do at the next bifurcation to keep things from drifting away from the final result I intend. The Creator's plan of the universe would thus be left blank as to many of its actual details, but all possibilities would be marked down. The realization of some of these would be left absolutely to chance, that is, would only be determined when the moments of realization came. Other possibilities would be contingently determined, that is, their decision would have to wait till it was seen how the matters of absolute chance fell out. But the rest of the plan, including its final upshot, would be rigorously determined once and for all. So the Creator himself would not need to know all the details of actuality until they came, and at any time his own view of the world would be a view partly of facts and partly of possibilities, exactly as ours is now. Of one thing, however, he might be certain, and that is that his world was safe, and that no matter how much of it he might be zigzag, he could surely bring it home at last. Now it is entirely immaterial in this scheme whether the Creator leave the absolute chance possibilities to be decided by himself, each when its prophet moment arrives, or whether, on the contrary, he alienate his power from himself, and leave the decision out and out to finite creatures such as we men are. The great point is that the possibilities are really here, whether it be we who solve them, or he working through us, at those soul-trying moments when fate's scales seem to quiver, and good snatches victory from evil, or shrinks nevertheless from fight, is of small account, so long as we admit that the issue is decided nowhere else than here and now. That is what gives the palpitating reality to moral life, and makes it tingle, as Mr. Mallock says, with so strange and elaborate an excitement. This reality, this excitement, are what their determinisms, hard and soft alike, suppress by their denial that anything is decided here and now, and their dogma that all things were foredoomed and settled long ago. If it be so,
may you and I then have to be foredoomed to the error of continuing to believe in liberty. It is fortunate for the winding up of controversy that in every discussion with determinism, the argumentum and hominum can be its adversary's last word.
Determinism and Morals, Bertrand Russell. Importance to ethics of the free will question as a subject upon which there has existed almost as much diversity of opinion as one on the free will question itself. It has been urged by advocates of free will that its denial involves the denial of merit and demerit, and that with the denial of these, ethics collapses. It has been urged on the other side that unless we can foresee, at least partially, the consequences of our actions, it is impossible to know what course we ought to take under any given circumstance, and that if other people's actions cannot be in any degree predicted, the foresight required for rational action becomes impossible. I do not propose in the following discussion to go into the free will controversy itself. The grounds in favour of determinism appear to me overwhelming, and I shall content myself with a brief indication of these grounds. The question I am concerned with is not the free will question itself, but the question how, if at all, morals are affected by assuming determinism. In considering this question, as in most of the other problems of ethics, the moralist who has not had a philosophical training appears to me to go astray, and become involved in needless complications through supposing that right and wrong in conduct are the ultimate conception of ethics, rather than good and bad in the effects of conduct and in other things. The words good and bad are used both for the sort of conduct which is right or wrong, and for the sort of effects to be expected from right and wrong conduct, respectively. We speak of a good picture, a good dinner, and so on, as well as the good action, but there is a great difference between these two meanings of good. Roughly speaking, a good action is one of which the probable effects are good in the other sense. It was confusing to have two meanings for one word, and we therefore agreed in the previous section to speak of a right action rather than a good action. In order to decide whether an action is right, it is necessary, as we have seen, to consider its probable effects. If the probable effects are, on the whole, better than those of any other action which is possible under the circumstances, the action is right. The things that are good are things which on their own account, and apart from any consideration of their effects, we ought to wish to see in existence. They are such things that we suppose might make the world appear to the Creator worth creating. I do not wish to deny that right conduct is among the things that are good on their own account, but if it is so, it depends for its intrinsic goodness upon the goodness of those other things which it aims at producing, such as love and happiness. Thus the rightness of conduct is not the fundamental conception upon which ethics is built up. This fundamental conception is intrinsic goodness or badness. As the outcome of our discussions in the previous section, I shall assume the following definitions. The objectively right action in any circumstances is that action which, of all that are possible, gives us, when account is taken of all available data, the greatest expectation of a probable good effect, or the least expectation of a probable bad effect. The subjectively right or moral action is that one which will be judged by the agent to be objectively right if he devotes to the question an appropriate amount of candid thought, or, in the case of actions that ought to be impulsive, a small amount. The appropriate amount of thought depends on the importance of the action and the difficulty of the decision. An act is neither moral nor immoral when it is unimportant, and a small amount of reflection would not suffice to show whether it was right or wrong. After these preliminaries, we can pass to the consideration of our main topic. The principle of causality, that every event is determined by previous events, and can, theoretically, be predicted when enough previous events are known, appears to apply just as much to human actions as to other events. It cannot be said that its application to human actions, or to any other phenomena, is wholly beyond doubt, but a doubt extended to the principle of causality must be so fundamental as to involve all science, all everyday knowledge, and everything, or almost everything, that we believe about the actual world. If causality is doubted, morals collapse, since a right action, as we have seen, is one which the probable effects are the best possible, so that estimates of right and wrong necessarily presuppose that our actions can have effects, and therefore the law of causality holds. In favour of the view that human actions alone are not effects of causes, there appears to be no ground whatsoever except the sense of spontaneity. But the sense of spontaneity only affirms that we can do as we choose, and choose as we please, which no determinist denies. It cannot affirm that our choice is independent of all motives, and indeed introspection tends rather to show the opposite. It is said by the advocates of free will that determinism destroys morals, since it shows that all our actions are inevitable, and that therefore they deserve neither praise nor blame. Let us consider how far, if at all, this is the case. The part of ethics which is concerned not with conduct but with the meaning of good and bad, and the things that are intrinsically good and bad, is plainly quite independent of free will. Causality belongs to the description of the existing world, and we saw that no interference can be drawn from what exists to what is good. Whether, then, causality holds always, sometimes, or never is a question wholly irrelevant in the consideration of intrinsic goods and evils. But when we come to conduct and the notion of ought, we cannot be sure that determinism makes no difference. For we saw that objectively right action may be defined as that one which, of all that are possible under the circumstances, will probably, on the whole, have the best consequences. The action which is objectively right must therefore be in some sense possible, but if determinism is true, there is a sense in which no action is possible except that one which is actually performed. Hence, if the two senses of the possibility are the same, the action actually performed is always objectively right. For it is the only possible action, and therefore there is no other possible action which could have better results. There is here, I think, a real difficulty. But let us consider the various kinds of possibility which may be meant. In order that an act may be a possible act, it must be physically possible to perform, it must be possible to think of, and must be possible to choose if we think of it. Physical possibility to begin with is obviously necessary. There are circumstances under which I might do a great deal of good by running from Oxford to London in 5 minutes, but I should not be called unwise or guilty of an objectively wrong act for omitting to do so. We may define an act as physically possible when it will occur if I will it. Acts for which this condition fails are not to be taken account of estimating rightness or wrongness. To judge whether an act is possible to think of is more difficult, but we certainly take account of it in judging what a man ought to do. There is no physical impossibility about employing one's spare moments in writing lyric poems better than any yet written, and this would certainly be more useful employment than most find of their spare moments. But we do not blame people for not writing lyric poems unless, like Fitzgerald, they are people that we feel could have written them. And not only do we not blame them, but we feel that their action may be objectively as well as subjectively right, if it is the wisest they could have thought of. But what they have thought of is not the same as what they did think of. Suppose a man in a fire of a shipwreck becomes so panic-stricken that he never for a moment thinks of the help that is due to other people. We do not on that account hold that he does right in only thinking of himself. Hence, in some sense, though it is not quite clear what sense that is, some of the courses of action which a man does not think of are regarded as possible for him to think of, though others are admittedly impossible. There is a sense in which it must be possible to think of an action if we are to hold that it is objectively wrong not to perform the action. There is also, if determinism is true, a sense in which it is not possible to think of any action except those which we do think of. But it is questionable whether these two senses of possibility are the same. A man who inns that his house is on fire may run out of it in panic without thinking of warning the other inmates. But we feel, rightly or wrongly, that it was possible for him to think of warning them in a sense in which it is not possible a prosaic person to think of in a lyric poem. It may be that we are wrong in feeling this difference, and that what really distinguishes the two cases is dependence on the past decisions. That is to say, we may recognize that no different choice among alternatives thought of at any time would have turned an ordinary man into a good lyric poet, but that most men, by suitably choosing among alternatives actually thought of, can acquire the sort of character which will lead them to remember their neighbours in a fire. And if a man engages in some useful occupation of which a natural effect is to destroy his nerve, we may conceivably hold that this excuses his panic in an emergency. In such a point it would seem that our judgment may really be dependent on the view we take as to the existence of free will, for the believer in free will cannot allow any such excuse. If we try to state the difference we feel between the case of the lyric poems and the case of the fire, it seems to come to this, that we do not hold an act objectively wrong when it would have required that we recognized a special aptitude in order to think of a better act, and then we believe that the agent did not possess this aptitude. But this distinction seems to imply that there is not such a thing as special aptitude for this, or that virtue, a view which cannot, I think, be maintained. An aptitude for generosity or for kindness may be such a natural gift as an aptitude for poetry, and an aptitude for poetry may be as much improved by practice as an aptitude for kindness or generosity. Thus it would seem that there is no sense in which it is possible to think of some actions which in fact we do not think of, but impossible to think of others, except the sense that the ones we regard as possible would have been thought of if a different choice among alternatives actually thought of had been made on some previous occasion. We shall then modify our previous definition of the objectively right action by saying that it is the probably most beneficial among these that occur to the agent at the moment of choice. But we shall hold that in certain cases, the fact that a more beneficial alternative does not occur to him is evidence of a wrong choice on some previous occasion. But since occasions of choice do often arise, and since there certainly is a sense in which it was possible to choose any one of a number of different actions as right and some as wrong, our previous definitions of objectively right actions and of moral actions still hold, with the modification that among physically possible actions, only those which we actually think of are to be regarded as possible. When several alternative actions present themselves, it is certain that we can both do which we choose and choose which we will. In this sense, all the alternatives are possible. What determinism maintains is that our will to choose this or that alternative is the effect of antecedents, but this does not prevent our will from being itself a cause of other effects, and the sense in which different actions are possible seems sufficient to distinguish some actions as right and some as wrong, some as moral and some as immoral. Connected with this is another sense in which we deliberate. Either decision is possible. The fact that we judge on one course objectively right may be the cause of our choosing this course. Thus, before we've decided as to which course we think right, either is possible in the sense that either, ill, result from our decision as to which we think right. This sense of possibility is important to the moralist, and illustrates the fact that determinism does not make moral deliberation futile. Determinism does not, therefore, destroy the distinction of right and wrong, and we saw before that it does not destroy the distinction of good and bad. We shall still be able to regard some people as better than others, and some actions as more right than others, but it is said that praise and blame and responsibility are destroyed by determinism. When a madman commits what an insane man which would call a crime, we do not blame him, partly because he probably cannot judge rightly as to the consequences, but partly also because we feel that he could not have done otherwise. If all men are really in the position of the madman, it would seem that all ought to escape blame. I think the question of choice really decides as to praise and blame. The madman, we believe, excluding the case of the wrong judgment as to consequences, did not choose between different courses, but was impelled by a blind impulse. The sane man who, say, commits a murder, has, on the contrary, either at the time of the murder or at some earlier time, chosen the worst of two or more alternatives that occurred to him, and it is this for which we blame him. It is true that the two cases can merge into each other, and the madman may be blamed if he has become mad in consequence of self-indulgence, but it is right that two cases should not be too sharply distinguished, for we know how hard it is often in practice to decide whether people are, what is called, responsible for their actions. It is sufficient that there is a distinction, and that it can be applied easily in most cases. Though there are marginal cases which present difficulties, we apply praise or blame then, and we attribute responsibility where a man having to exercise choice has chosen wrongly, and this sense of praise or blame is not destroyed by determinism. Determinism, then, does not in any way interfere with morals. It is worth noticing that free will, on the contrary, would interfere most seriously, if anybody really believed in it. People never do, as a matter of fact, believe that anyone else's actions are not determined by motives, however much they may think themselves free. Bradshaw consists entirely of predictions as to the actions of engine drivers, but no one doubts Bradshaw on the ground that the volition of engine drivers are not governed by motives. If we really believed that other people's actions did not have causes, we could never try to influence other people's actions, for such influence can only result if we know, more or less, what causes will produce the actions we desire. If we could never try to influence other people's actions, no man could try to get elected to Parliament, or ask a woman to marry him. Argument, exhortation, and command would become mere idle breath. Thus, almost all actions with which morality is concerned would become irrational. Rational action would be wholly precluded from trying to influence people's volitions, and right and wrong would be interfered with in a way in which determinism certainly does not interfere with them. Most morality absolutely depends upon the assumption that volitions have causes, and nothing in morals is destroyed by this assumption. Most people, it is true, do not hold the free will doctrine in so extreme a form as that against which we have been arguing. They would hold that most of a man's actions have causes, but that some few, say 1%, are uncaused, spontaneous assertions of will. If this view is taken, unless we can mark off the 1% of volitions which are uncaused, every interference as to human action is infected with what we may call 1% of doubt. This, it must be admitted, would not matter much in practice, because on other grounds there were usually at least 1% of doubt in predictions as to human actions. But from the standpoint of theory, there is a wide difference. The sort of doubt that must be admitted in any case is a sort which is capable of indefinite diminution, while the sort derived from the possible intervention of free will is absolute and ultimate. In so far, therefore, as the possibility of uncaused volitions comes in, all the consequences above pointed out follow, and in so far as it does not come in, determinism holds. Thus 1% of free will has 1% of the objectionableness of absolute free will, and has also 1% of the ethical consequences. In fact, however, no one really holds that right acts are uncaused. It would be a monstrous paradox to say that a man's decision ought not to be influenced by his belief as to what is his duty, yet if he allows himself to decide on an act because he believes it to be his duty, his decision has a motive, i.e. a cause, and is not free in the only sense which the determinist must deny freedom. It would seem, therefore, that the objections to determinism are mainly attributable to misunderstanding of its purport. Hence, finally, it is not determinism but free will that has subverted consequences. There is therefore no reason to regret that the grounds in favour of determinism are overwhelmingly strong. Some quotations. One doubts existence of free will because every action determined by hereditary constitution, example of others, or teaching of others. This view should teach one profound humility. One deserves no credit for anything, nor ought one to blame others. Charles Darwin. To understand this is to realize that we are not authors of our own thoughts and actions in the way that people generally suppose. Of course, this insight does not make social and political freedom any less important. The freedom to do what one intends and not to do otherwise is no less valuable than it ever was. Having a gun to your head is still a problem worth rectifying, wherever intentions come from. But the idea that we, as conscious beings, are deeply responsible for the character of our mental lives and subsequent behaviour is simply impossible to map onto reality. Consider what it would take to actually have free will. You would need to be aware of all the factors that determine your thoughts and actions, and you would need to have the complete control over those factors. But there is a paradox here that vitiates the very notion of freedom. For what would influence the influences? More influences. None of these adventitious mental states the real you. You are not controlling the storm, and you are not lost in it. You are the storm. Sam Harris, Free Will.